class, per our assignment, we had to discuss Thomas Jefferson's legacy. And I decided to take this in a different route than probably most of our classmates would decide to discuss. And the reason I do that is not to discount who Thomas Jefferson was. I feel like he was a great man and he stood for a lot of things, as we'll see later in this presentation. But there were a lot of things that don't match up with what he claimed to have believed and what ultimately would come to fruition, of what would result from that. And so we knew that legacy was important to Thomas Jefferson, so important that when he designed his gravestone, he put on his epitaph, author of the Declaration of Independence and of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. These were three things that he felt he needed to be remembered for. These are three areas that he felt like he contributed to society that is ultimately going to make the most lasting decision. And many people would agree with that. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence because of his ability to articulate, his writing skills, his philosophical beliefs, the notion of freedom, whether it was religious freedom, freedom of government, those types of things. He believed in that, and so they felt like he was a great candidate to write out the Declaration of Independence. Now, the legacy that Thomas Jefferson left was a legacy that was most impactful for free men. Now, I emphasize the word free men. In the Declaration, it speaks of all men are created equal. We're all aware of this. We all know this. The thing that's interesting is slavery was so important. It was a part of an economical system there, that it was just everyday life. And so when writing this draft and ultimately what would become the Declaration of Independence, I don't think there was the connection of free and slave. I think it was just, this is who we're talking about. And if these slaves become free, then yes, they'll fall under it. Now, Thomas Jefferson owned roughly 200 slaves. About 40% were inherited from his father, but the rest, the 60%, were his. He owned them, whether he gained them through trade or he purchased them. Now, in his lifetime, remember, Thomas Jefferson stood for freedom. He stood for equal standing before God, right? He only freed 2 slaves in his lifetime. 5 were freed after his death, and then 2 escaped, and he decided not to embark on chasing them. So you could say in his lifetime, there were 9 out of the 200 slaves that he owned that were released. Now, he hated slavery. He despised slavery. I was actually surprised in my research to find how much Thomas Jefferson detested slavery. He hated what it was. He did not believe in it, but there were some things that stood out to me that he believed that were perhaps, there were red flags for me. He believed in this notion of gradual emancipation. Now, what that means is, instead of freeing all the slaves at once, granting them freedom all at once like Abraham Lincoln sought to do, he believed in slowly integrating them into freedom, giving them freedom individually, one at a time, not as a mass means. And ways that he did this was he discouraged heavily dependent slave labor trades, meaning tobacco. He wanted to halt tobacco production because it was so dependent upon slave labor, and he wanted to increase things like wheat and sugar maples and short-grained rice or olive trees and wine grapes, because these things required less labor, meaning it would be less slaves to do the work. Ultimately, it would still be the slaves that would do this work. It would just be less slaves to do this work. Now, Thomas Jefferson believed that the 2 races, white and black, were 2 separate nations. That blacks needed to be removed as per emancipation, meaning when they were emancipated, they needed to leave the nation. They needed to go somewhere else. He believed that this was the whites' land, this is where they lived, and the blacks, upon being given their freedom, needed to go somewhere else. And that stood out to me. That was an interesting thing. And he was quoted as saying this regarding the maintenance of slavery. He said it was like holding a wolf by the ear. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Meaning, if we continue down this path of upholding slavery, it's eventually gonna bite us in the butt. But if we let go, it's not gonna go away peacefully. It's not going to go away without an uprising. And ultimately, we would see that later on in history. he did believe, and this was a prophecy of his, that if slavery continued down the path that it was on, it would eventually result in a revolt like it did in Haiti in 1791. This obviously amounted to the Civil War. This amounted to the Civil War, and we saw that it was a nation divided against itself over this idea of slavery. Now, what's interesting is there's many reports that Thomas Jefferson was married to Sally Hemings for approximately 40 years upon his wife's death. Now, with that marriage, there's also the belief that he fathered several of her children. In fact, in a 1998 study, we see that Easton Hemings, who was the last born child that would have came from Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings' marriage and relationship, could in fact have been a child of Thomas Jefferson. They went through the lineage. They obviously couldn't test Thomas Jefferson's DNA, but they were able to test multiple family members in his lineage and see that there was a possible connection between these things. Obviously nothing definitive, but a lot of experts believe that we can rely on science in saying that this is a possibility. Now, what surprises me about this relationship is Thomas Jefferson was so voiced, and so he advocated so much for the ending of slavery and the abolishment of slavery. And he believed in this two-nation idea, this separation of the whites and blacks, which leads me to believe, I mean, where would he have stood on the Jim Crow laws? Where would he have stood on segregation? Because essentially they were two races living in two different nations, right? They had two different benefits, two different factors. And so where would have Thomas Jefferson have stood during this? But I don't know if that was truly Thomas Jefferson's heart. I don't know if he actually detested slaves or African Americans. I don't know if he detested black people. He was in a relationship with Sally Hemings for roughly 40 years. It's believed that they had several children together. You don't do that with someone if you're detesting them. And we know that sexual violations did happen with many slave owners and the slaves, but this was not the case with Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson per reports. This was a cordial, mutual relationship that was founded on love. And so I don't think Thomas Jefferson was someone that was for slavery. I don't think he detested blacks. I just don't think he had the backbone or the courage to stand up to society. I don't think he was willing to risk his neck to stand up to the masses. Because like he said, he believed that eventually a slave revolt would happen, which it did come to pass. It did happen. And I don't think he wanted to be the one that had the blood on his hands for that happening, much like Abraham Lincoln. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you learned something new.
Daddy,
Thank you.
what's a will?
Yeah.